You know, last year was a pretty disruptive year for elections in the United States. As we go through tonight, though, you may notice, particularly when we get into 1860, you may notice a few similarities. You've got to know what the basis is. So, obviously, with your voting, a majority means that you got more than half of the total. Plurality, this means you didn't get more than half the total, but you got more than anybody else. And popular vote means you got a higher number of votes than any of the other candidates. And of course, electoral votes is where all the voting ends up after they figure out the popular vote. Okay, so does the candidate with the majority of the popular vote gets elected as president?
No.
Well, history would say yes, about 39 out of the 58 U.S. presidential elections. In 19 elections, with 16 different candidates, a president was elected with less than a majority of the popular vote. Starting back in 1824. Now, John Adams had the absolute lowest. Abraham Lincoln came in second as far as lowest. These are in date order, as you noticed. And then Woodrow Wilson in 1912 came in third, and then the others at different rates. But Democrat candidates 10 times, Republican candidate 7 times, a Whig candidate once, and Democratic Republican 1 time. Democratic Republican was back in the beginning of the 1800s. And I can't tell you which party they morphed into, but it was neither Republican or Democrat. The highest percentage of popular votes, Lyndon Johnson, in the lifetime of most of us here, he had the highest percentage of the popular vote. And I'm sure that you can see some names on there that depend upon your political point of view, you either agree or disagree with. But popular vote does not elect the president. The majority of electoral votes elects the president. And that's happened in all cases except 2. Presidential elections in the beginning allowed for each elector to vote for 2 people. So a state elector could vote for 2 people. The only rule was he couldn't vote for 2 people from the same state. He had to vote, if he voted for somebody from New York, he could not vote for a second person from New York. The candidate with the most electoral votes became president. The second highest number became vice president. If no presidential candidate had a majority, the House of Representatives would choose from the 5 individuals with the greatest number of votes. The vice president was chosen by the Senate. In the 1800 election, the 2 major candidates were Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Jefferson had more electoral votes than Adams, but he was tied in electoral votes with his vice president candidate. Now, they didn't actually run by president and vice president, but Jefferson had made sure everybody knew that Aaron Burr was to be his vice president. So that's who he wanted as vice president. Because the tie, the election was decided by the House of Representatives. It took them 36 ballots to decide who was going to be president. And then they finally got it done about 8 days before the president was to be sworn in, and that was in March. So it took them a while to argue it out. And of course, Burr became vice president because he was second highest. As a result of that election, the 12th Amendment to the Constitution was enacted, and electors were to vote separately for the president and the vice president. And the majority of the elector votes decides the election. If no candidate received a majority, the president would be determined by the House of Representatives from the 3 candidates having the most votes. The vice president would be chosen by the Senate from the 2 candidates having the most votes. Now, in 1824, John Adams had only 29.8% of the popular vote and 31.8% of the electoral vote. There were 4 candidates: Adams, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and William Crawford. None of the 4 had a majority in electoral votes or in popular votes. Jackson had the plurality in both popular votes and electoral votes. The election was decided by the House of Representatives, who selected Adams on the first ballot. They took the top 3 candidates in to decide upon. Henry Clay, who was running for president, was number 4, so he wasn't one of the people to be considered. He happened to be Speaker of the House at the House of Representatives, and he hated Jackson. He used a little influence, and on the first ballot they were able to select Adams as president. Now, the 10 highest electoral majority votes, Lyndon Johnson was the 10th highest, and you go on down the row as to the 8 that had the highest electoral percentages. The number 2 and the number 1 was George Washington. 1789 was the very first election under our Constitution. The election was held, if you notice the dates, that's over a month for the election to be held. It wasn't held on one day, it was held over a period of time. And it was the first one under the new Constitution. There were 12 names on the ballot. Washington was the only one that wouldn't go for a party. Everybody else was Federalist or something or other, but Washington wasn't. There were 69 electors. Now remember, we only had 13 states back at this point in time. This was soon after the Revolution. All 69 electors voted for Washington. 34 of the electors gave the vote for John Adams as vice president. Out of the 13 states, only 10 states voted. North Carolina and Rhode Island were ineligible to vote because they hadn't ratified the Constitution. New York couldn't get their act together, and they failed to get their electors selected, so they didn't get to vote. The little map down there gives you an idea of the voting. It's estimated that 6% of the population participated in the election. And it's not due to lack of interest, but it was other problems. To be able to vote, you basically had to be white, male, a landowner, and educated. And if you were of a different religion or without property, and I'm not sure what the different religion was, but I've got my suspicions, you were considered unfit to vote because you didn't have enough sense to not be swayed by one candidate or another. It also, at this point in time, when you went to vote, you went to the voting place, and whoever was in charge of it gave you a ballot and said, okay, which one do you want to vote for? And in front of everybody that was there, you just then told everybody who you were going to vote for. So if your boss was standing in line or your next door neighbor, you might be swayed one way or the other. And voter turnout was inhibited due to the traveling, and most people were farmers. And it was hard for them to leave the farm and go take prolonged periods. And it took 2 months for them to let George Washington know that he got elected. And it took him a week to get from Virginia to New York to be sworn in. And of course, the capital was in New York City at this point in time. The next time he elected, there were 132 electors, and they all voted for him again. And then they made John Adams was vice president. Washington was our first president, right? Well, under the Articles of Confederation, they appointed, the members of that confederation appointed one of their members to be in charge, and they called him the president. And there were rules that they could only serve for a very short time, but over the years, 8 years, there were 10 different people that served 1 or 2 terms in this confederacy, and they were called president. So was Lincoln our first president, or was he our 11th president? I'm still going to go with number 1 myself. The oldest president at the time of his inauguration, of course, was Donald Trump. 70 years, 7 months, 7 days. A lot of sevens there. The youngest president at the time of his inauguration was Theodore Roosevelt. He was almost 43. 8 presidents have died in office. These 4 died of various health problems, and of course William Harrison holds the record for the shortest term served. He served 31 days. During his inauguration, he went out and stood in the rain and got very cold and wet. Remember, this was happening in March at that point in time. And he got pneumonia, and he lasted for 31 days and then died. Zachary Taylor died from not too long into his term. He liked ice water and cherries, and he one day ate too many cherries. They weren't all ripe, and he also drank a lot of ice water, had stomach problems, and he went. 4 of our presidents have been assassinated. There tells how long they lasted. Now, 9 vice presidents have replaced a president during the term of the president. The first 4 on the list there replaced, and then the next 4 also got elected after they served 1 term replacing their president, and then they also got elected as president. And then, of course, Gerald Ford, who wasn't really even elected as vice president, he got appointed as vice president, but then he took over for Nixon when Nixon went back to California. In 1944, Franklin Roosevelt was elected, and it was for his 4th time. And of course, after he died, then they changed the rules where a president can only serve 2 terms. But the way the wording is, it says they can only serve 2 consecutive terms. There's always been a question about could they come back later and serve, so we'll see. Now, his running mate was Harry S. Truman. We all know Harry, he was a Missourian. But he was basically unknown to the citizens. I remember reading that 12 weeks before the election, only 20% of the people in the United States could name Roosevelt's running mate. A month and a half after the election, only 30% could name who the new vice president was. He was an unknown. He had done very well in Congress, but he was an unknown, and from all indications, Roosevelt was pretty sure he wasn't going to complete his term. He was very sick going into the end of his 3rd term. So 3 months after Roosevelt took office for his 4th term, Truman became president. Now they say that this election in '48, when he ran for the presidency on his own, was one of the greatest election upsets in American history. 2 other Democrats ran competing campaigns, and they were all running against Thomas Dewey. Dewey was predicted to win. This is a cartoon from the time period, and basically Dewey is telling Truman, what's the use of going through the election? You know, just give it up to me. And Dewey was set to win. All the polls said he was going to win. The Chicago Daily Tribune was so sure that before the polls even closed, they printed the headline for their next day's paper. And of course, that's a picture that we've all seen. Dewey defeats Truman. Well, he didn't. Truman defeated him. He won 57% of the electoral votes and plurality of the popular votes. And he was not quite 61 years old when he was elected. Now, earlier I had said that the youngest president at the time of their inauguration was Theodore Roosevelt. Well, that was true at the time of their inauguration, but he's not the youngest person to ever serve as president. The youngest president was 41 and a half years old, and he was from Missouri. But you didn't know we had 2 presidents from Missouri. Senator David Rice Atkinson was our youngest president. He was 41 years old, and he served as president for 1 day on March 4th, 1849. That was Inauguration Day in 1849. The reason being is that President Polk's term was up, so on the 4th, Zachary Taylor was supposed to be sworn in. Zachary Taylor refused to be sworn in on a Sunday, and The office was temporarily filled by the next person in the order of succession. It's now been changed, but at that time it was President pro tempore of the Senate, and that was David Rice. As he said, I slept most of that day. He also made the comment that he neither fired or hired anybody on the day he was president. He was one of the worst people that could ever be president. He was pro-slavery. He recommended that you go out and kill abolitionists. In 1854, he personally led a mob from Missouri of 5,000 people over into Kansas, where they seized the polling places. At that point, in 1854, Kansas was trying to decide whether they would be a free state or a slave state. They went over, took over the polls, and got enough votes to make Kansas preliminarily a slave point. And then, of course, he joined the Confederate Army during the Civil War. Now, I'd like to get into talking about my favorite president. You all know that Lucinda Owens founded the town of Washington. Her husband was William Owens. Now, William Owens was shot and killed in 1834. But my favorite president did legal work for William Owens' father. He was a very close friend of one of William's sisters, actually boarded with her for a short time, and she suggested that my favorite president should marry her sister. He received his education from William's first cousin. He was turned down for marriage by one of William's sisters. He failed in business 3 times. He won 2 elections. He lost 7 elections, including once as Republican Party's candidate for vice president in 1856. He accepted a challenge to a duel in September of 1842, and he's the only president to hold a patent. The duel is very interesting. He had been writing letters to the newspaper, putting down this other politician on his looks, lack of attractiveness to females and whatever, and this other politician got very mad at him, and finally this president's sweetheart at the time wrote a letter to the newspaper. The other politician thought this candidate, or this one that I like, had written it. He challenged him to a duel. He accepted the challenge, but as the one being challenged, he got to accept or name the weapons. So he selected sabers. A saber is a very long sword. His thinking was that I'm 12 inches taller than this guy. I can reach farther than he can, so I can reach with this saber and kind of cut him a little, and then that'll do it. I mean, you know, in the duel, you didn't actually have to kill anybody. It was just that you faced the other person. So they came to Missouri, because Missouri did not have a law against dueling. And they actually had their duel on Bloody Island, which was an island in the Mississippi River just off in downtown St. Louis. As they got ready to do the duel, this individual took it, you know, that I'm happy with, the taller one, took his sword and he went like that and cut off a couple tree branches above the opponent's head. The opponent realized that he was strong enough to cut off some tree branches with that sword, and he had the reach on him, so he accepted the second's decision to put off the duel, and the duel was never held. One of his sweethearts died. One sweetheart turned down a marriage proposal. He proposed to a woman who was courted by 2 men who would become opposing candidates for president. He broke the engagement, and then 23 months later he got re-engaged and married on the same day. And of course I'm talking about Abraham Lincoln. This is how Lincoln looked in 1842. Now, emotions were tense in the United States leading up to the 1860 election. The Compromise of 1850 started talking about the Fugitive Slave Act, which meant that if a slave escaped to the northern states, if you had the slave, you couldn't keep it. They could come take the slave, take it back to the southern state. They were talking about popular sovereignty. In other words, let the state, as a new territory became a state, let the state decide if they wanted to be a slave state or a free state. Leading Kansas in 1856, the Kansas-Nebraska Act said both Kansas and Nebraska will get a chance that people living there will decide whether they want to be slave or free. A bunch of Missourians went over and sacked the town of Lawrence, and John Brown, who was very much an abolitionist, had a little massacre there and killed about 4 or 5 people. The Dred Scott decision, the slave who had sued for his freedom, that decision was made by the Supreme Court, and they determined that slaves are property. Slaves are not considered a person under the U.S. Constitution, may be taken anywhere in the United States, and the Missouri Compromise was eliminated. The Missouri Compromise, which was done back in the 1820s, said that anything above the southern border of Missouri, anything north of that in the future would be a free state. Slave states could only be below that. So it upset a lot of people, and so tensions were building. Now, Stephen Douglas was a U.S. politician, a leader of the Democratic Party. He had served 2 terms in the House of Representatives, and he was elected to the Senate twice. He was involved in every major issue that came up in Washington during his time there. And he was proposed as his party's nomination for president in both 1852 and 1856, but someone else became their nominee. He appeared to be the leading and unbeatable Democratic candidate as 1860 approached. The Republican Party had a long list of candidates. By the time of their convention, 12 people would receive votes to be the candidate. But William Stewart had been New York governor, and he was currently a senator. He was everybody's consideration to be the Republican candidate. Particularly, he believed that he was the candidate. So much so that he bought a new set of clothes, took a boat to England, and met with the Queen in advance of the convention in the year preceding, so that he would get to know the Queen and the royalty, so that when he became president, they would have already established a relationship. The Whig Party, which had been in existence against the Democrats for a number of years, was foundering. Most of its people had gone to the Republican Party. On April 23rd, the Democrat convention in Baltimore, Maryland, Stephen Douglas, considered the leading candidate. 8 candidates were nominated, which also happened to include Jefferson Davis, who later became president of the Confederate States. They could not agree on a candidate, and the disagreement was on the slavery question. Stephen Douglas had pushed for this popular sovereignty, where people within the states could decide whether they would be free or slave state. The Southerners wanted slave states allowed in any place, or slaves actually allowed in any state in the U.S., including the future states. There was a disagreement. They couldn't agree on a candidate. They said that we'll meet again. The Whigs formed their party. They didn't want to take a stand against anything other than let's believe in the Constitution. They hoped by not taking a stand that the issue could be pushed to one side. They felt like it was an issue that should just be given time, like it had been given for years and years. And John Bell was selected as from the 10 candidates. In May of 1860, Republicans held their convention in Chicago. They had 12 candidates, which included Lincoln and Edward Bates, who was from Missouri. Stewart was the front runner. It required 233 votes in the convention to win the candidacy. 12 candidates, all 12 candidates that had their name in the ring, received votes on the first ballot. Stewart was leading on the first ballot. Lincoln was second. On the second ballot, Stewart was again first, and Lincoln was second. On the third ballot, Stewart had 180. Lincoln had 231 and a half, which was 1.5 short of getting the election. Ohio raised their hand and said, oh, we made a mistake, we need to change our vote, we need to take 4 votes that we had over here and move them over to Lincoln, which everybody was keeping track as it went along, which meant that he was going to be the candidate. So he got it on the 3rd ballot in that sense. And of course then all the other states started saying, oh, we want to change our votes, we want to change ours. And finally New York, which was where Stewart was from, got up and moved that it be unanimous, and they made it unanimous. So now how did Lincoln get to this point? You have to know that Lincoln was a prosperous lawyer who enjoyed a middle-level lifestyle or class existence. And he had gone through a whole lot of elections and had lost a lot. The only time he really got elected, he got elected to the state legislature once, and he got elected once to the Congress, to the House of Representatives. Douglas, rather, was a senator from Illinois. And Douglas started pushing this popular sovereignty. And it so riled up Lincoln that Lincoln said, no, we got to fight it. And so he got the Republicans in Illinois to appoint him as their candidate for senator. At that point in time, the people didn't elect the senator from Illinois, the state legislature did. But the state legislature had both Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, so it was a matter of convincing the majority of the state legislators to vote for one or the other. So Lincoln and Douglas had 7 debates spread across the state of Illinois in 1858. Today, of course, we have television, we have radio, we've got people holding up their cell phones, you know, taking pictures of the candidates. And what you have to remember back then, the only news outlets that they had basically was newspapers. Newspapers had finally realized that it was important, and they realized that this particular series of debates was going to be very important because of the nature of the 2 candidates and what they stood for, and slavery had become such a hot topic. So what they did was they hired stenographers to go to the debates and take down every word. And each debate usually lasted 3 hours. Halfway through the debate, the stenographer would hand the notes to a runner. The runner would take off for the train station, jump on a train, and head for Chicago. And on the way to Chicago, they would translate the stenographer's notes into readable English. And by the time they got to Chicago, they could hand it to the typesetter, and they could hand it to the telegraph operators, and the telegraph operators telegraphed it all over the United States. So all of a sudden, here in a state election was getting publicity all over the United States. If you remember, Kennedy had a lot of problems back in 1960 with television. Television suddenly was, you know, more than 4 stations in each house and that sort of thing. And so he had problems learning how to handle it. Douglas and Lincoln knew that this was happening, and they had troubles handling it, but they moved on it anyway. As a point of interest, Lincoln had his, when he finally was a candidate for president, he had his speeches from the debates set in print and distributed across all the northern states. After this debate series, Lincoln, who now was beginning to get some recognition, when he did run for president, was the first person to run for president that wasn't from the east side of the United States. He was a hillbilly from the west, from the Midwest. And everybody back east thought everybody in the Midwest were unsophisticated. But he was beginning to be understood as a contender. He spent 16 months traveling all over giving speeches. In February of 1860, he gave a speech at the Cooper Union in New York, and this again was publicized across the United States, and he very clearly defined that he did not want to eliminate slavery where slavery currently existed, even though he thought it was wrong, but he was totally against slavery being added to any additional state or being in the expansion. But after making all these speeches for local politicians and everything, there were a lot of politicians indebted to him for the support he'd given them. Another thing that worked well for him, he was not in office, and he was new to national prominence, and he hadn't offended anybody. So nobody thought badly about him. He also, we all have a tendency to think that Lincoln just suddenly got nominated for president, but he had been thinking about it ever since 1858. And he had campaign managers, he established campaign managers in all the different states. And they were very active in building support for him. And then the Illinois Republican Party did a couple of, like, I don't know if to call them sneaky things or not, but they suggested to the National Republican Party that the convention ought to be held in a neutral spot. And the National Republican Party said, yeah, that's a good idea. What's your suggestion? And they said, how about Chicago? That should be a nice neutral spot. And they said, okay, we'll do it in Chicago. The Illinois Republican Party managed to print a whole lot of fake tickets to the convention and give them to their supporters, and they flooded the floor with their supporters, and every time anything was said about Lincoln, they would all applaud and yell. And so I would really call it not a neutral position. But Lincoln also said, and I quote, "I authorize no bargains and will be bound by none," unquote. When he was talking to his campaign managers, they kind of ignored him, and they made a whole lot of bargains to get votes. And he finally then, on the third ballot, became the Republican candidate. Now the Democrats met again in Baltimore. The Northern Democrats wanted popular sovereignty. The Southern Democrats wanted slavery everywhere. The Southern Democrats walked out of the convention. Stephen Douglas was selected from 4 candidates. The Southern Democrats met a little later. They supported a slave code for all states. They also supported the acquisition of Cuba and the construction of a railroad to the Pacific Ocean. And John Breckinridge, the incumbent Vice President of the United States, was selected as their candidate. He was currently the Vice President of the United States. So here were the 4 candidates going into the election. The 3 names in black all have a common background in that they all squired Mary Todd in her youth around the countryside. Breckinridge did it down in Kentucky, and then of course Lincoln had done it in Illinois, and then when Lincoln broke his engagement to Mary Todd and went away for a while, Douglas started squiring her around, and then Lincoln came back. So anyway, all three of those men, all current terminology, they all dated her. All right, now, the principal issue, of course, was slavery and its expansion, but they also had debate on some other things. Preservation of the Union, the rights of the states, construction of the transcontinental railroad, at least that was a pretty big pretty big dollar project, not maybe as much as building a wall, but it was a costly thing. Extravagance in government, the government was already kind of a little bit in debt, and they had to try to figure out how to get out of debt. And then the rights of the immigrants. Immigrants were getting to be too many of them, and they were trying to figure out how to handle the immigrant situation. Became a white-hot campaign. At that point in time, candidates did not go out and campaign. They stayed at home, let other people campaign for them. Douglas, though, he said he had to go see his mother in New England, but he went to see his mother via the southern states and up through the East Coast up to New England, and they said every time the train stopped, he got out on the back platform and gave a speech. And there was a lot of cartoons done showing him with that and putting him down. Breckinridge gave one speech, Bell said nothing, and Lincoln referred everyone to his previous comments that were in printed documents that they could be distributed. He also had a picture taken that he had copies made and sent all over so that people could see what he looked like. One of the cartoons from then showed the four candidates, and they were tearing the country apart. This was somebody who was unhappy with what was going on, a cartoonist. He said, you know, you're tearing them apart. Now, there were cartoons about all the candidates, because all the candidates were both liked and disliked, so there were cartoons both ways, but I've just picked a few of them. This was one against Lincoln, and they were saying that Lincoln loved the blacks and that he was getting this guy ready to take over from him when he was no longer in office. As you can see, an heir to the throne. They also, this one, that the Republican Party was going to the right house, lunatic asylum. And you can't read them, but the comments by each of the characters kind of goes along with things along that line. This one was the only thing he had going for him is he knew how to split rails. His whole platform was rail splitting. There were nastier ones than that, very much nastier, and it's been considered to be one of the nastier comments about candidates until more recent time. The 1860 population of the U.S. was about 32.5 million, including 4 million slaves. The other thing you had to remember was electoral votes are based on the number of people, number of representatives you have in the House of Representatives plus 2 for senators. So based on your population, that's how many electors you get. Now, back prior to the Civil War, the slaves were counted in the population, but they were only counted as 3/5. So in these southern states, the slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person. If they only counted whites or Caucasians or non-black, the southern states would have had a much lower population and they would not have had as many electors. So they worked that deal out way back in the early parts of the country, or the time, that the slaves would count as 3/4. Anyway, about half of the population was old enough to vote. Only about 45% of the eligible population could vote, because you had to be a male, you had to be white, and you had to be a property owner. So about 4.7 million voted, about 81% of the eligible voters. It is interesting that Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire did allow African Americans to vote. All those states had some free African Americans and they were allowed to vote. Missouri, Lincoln came in last. Missouri, by their voting, basically said, you know, slavery question ought to just kind of let it ride and let the people decide it. Whereas, you know, Breckinridge was saying let it go everywhere, and Lincoln said no, not in the expansion. So Missouri was kind of middle of the road. Overall, Lincoln had only 39.9% of the popular vote, but with the states that he got that vote in, he ended up with 180 electoral votes, which was enough to win the presidency. If you total up the electoral votes for the other 3 candidates, you'll notice that it doesn't add up to as much as what Lincoln got. So the statement is that you know, even if the other 3 candidates had been merged into one, that one would still not have won. But that is not a total correct assumption, and maybe we don't know for sure. But if there had only those last 3, if there had only been one candidate, let's say it had only been Douglas, he might have taken a couple other states that went to Lincoln, and it could have been. It could have also come down to a point where neither one had enough electoral votes and it would have gone into the House of Representatives for the decision. And if that's the case, Lincoln probably would have lost because of each state was allowed one vote in the House of Representatives when they voted for the presidency. And there was probably enough votes there between the Southern leaning and the Douglas leaning or whatever that Lincoln might not have been elected. Lincoln was not on the ballot in 10 of the southern states. He wasn't even on the ballot. They wouldn't let him on the ballot. South Carolina, they didn't even have a ballot. They didn't have popular voting. The state legislature got together, or the party officials got together, and they decided who their electoral votes would go to, but the rank and file population didn't vote at that time in South Carolina. So anyway, those states did not allow Lincoln on the ballot. He was elected November 6, 1860. You know, a little over a month later, South Carolina seceded, and by February 1st, you know, 6 more had seceded. And you remember at this point in time, inauguration occurred on March 4th. So he was inaugurated on March 4th. Now, you'll see the picture at the bottom. This picture was taken right about the time of the election. If you remember, previous pictures of him showed him clean shaven, and then we all think of him in all of the pictures we look at with the full beard and everything. But you remember the story, the little girl that wrote a letter to him said that he would look much better with a beard. He started growing a beard, and you can see just the shade of it a little bit, but it's not the full beard that he had in later time. April 12th, Fort Sumter fired upon, and 4 more states seceded, and we went into the Civil War. Now, this last statement here, technically, the United States never declared war on the Confederacy. Because if you to declare war, you've got to admit that they're a nation. You don't declare war on yourself, you declare war on other nations. And the last thing they wanted to do was to allow the Confederacy to be considered as a nation. They were rebels. They were seceding, whatever. And so on July 4th, 1861, he wrote a long message to the Congress. And this one statement there is about as close as he came in his statement to declaring war. I mean, obviously, he said we got to have troops. And prior to this point, he had already called for troops, and there'd already been some battles, whatever. But he technically never declared war on the South. And today we hear lots of statements about the treason. It was treason when they seceded. Nobody in the South has ever tried for treason. The United States did not try a single person for treason. Even Jefferson Davis didn't get tried. He was imprisoned for quite a while, and several others were imprisoned, but he was never tried for treason. And the only individual that was tried and executed by the U.S. government in connection with the Civil War was the one who ran the prison camp in Georgia. And he was tried and executed because of the 10,000 prisoners that died there. Actually, it wasn't so much his fault because they didn't give him food and whatever. So anyway, if you stop and think about it, when the U.S. left Britain, we seceded. If we had lost the war, would we, our leaders, have been tried for treason? I don't know. This is one of my favorite things from the election. This man from Frankfort, Missouri, at age 30, during the election, he said, if Lincoln is elected, I will never shave again. And he never shaved, and you can see his beard. It was 12 feet long by the time he died. So, you know, what goes around comes around. There's a lot of things happening today that happened in the past. And that's the end of my talk.